This channel is supported by Truefire. Truefire is an online library
enough, you can get the Truefire All Access Pass for as cheap as they ever do it, the $99 thing. So just jump and do that if you're looking for the best price that you can get Truefire All Access for.
Since modelers have been a thing, certainly as long as I've known about them, I think, so I jumped in at about Pod XT Live. There's always been a little bit of a question about how you can bring these sounds that are quite direct. And I know that they're, you know, modeled on amps and stuff like that, but the tones basically are created measuring electrical signals to some extent, right? And not an amp in a room, right? That's not how it happens. You don't have like a Vox AC15 in a room and then someone goes, that's exactly it. We can capture that. Now, in this video, I'll talk to you through some of my ideas around how we can get some of that back, but also exercise some amount of caution with some of this stuff, and also try it all for yourself, because all opinions may vary on this. Your system, your playing, all of these bits and pieces will vary greatly. Like with a real amplifier, we're now at the stage in 2025 where most modelers, you could actually move a virtual mic around a speaker. Now, what I tend to do with this, and this was not a thing that was possible in the Helix back in the day when I would have made these videos to start with, is just to move that mic off of the center of the cone. And I think maybe this should be step one. just experiment with the mic positioning. So before you do your high cut, you might find that actually, if you're not using tons of gain, that it might just be appropriate just to go, right, I'm going to move to, I don't know, 3.9 is a number that works for me really nicely on the Kali V30. Like off of the dust cap virtually, and see how that sounds. So that might be my first starting point. Beyond that, you might find, right, actually when I start to introduce more drive, which is where there tend to be problems, right? Because clean tones, for whatever reason, they don't tend to have as, well, I know why. It's because they're not as full range they're not as full range frequency wise. And once you start to add drive, it gets more like you're throwing white noise essentially through your digital modeler. And then that's why you get, you know, these extra sorts of things where it's like, oh, well, this one, now I'm hearing way more of the upper spiky stuff because you're actually throwing a fuller frequency into that virtual amp. So clean, you might not need a high cut particularly, but as you start to add more drive, it's probably a good idea to then start thinking, right, I either need to position this mic virtually differently or start to apply a high cut depending on how much drive you're using and how much you're finding this turns spiky quickly.
Okay, I just want to show you, now I've not been in a room properly with a Soldano. I'm close to my monitor, so this is why you're going to hear things. So our first port of call, I guess, whatever mic you've chosen, so microphone choice in and of itself is really important. For me, the 67 condenser is already a little darker. Ribbon is even darker still. So just listen to them and find the one that works best for you. Now, the next thing to do, change that position. So again, that's super important. Like if you hear the difference between we've already done a big deal of I'm doing this specifically with a heavier tone and more drive than I would ordinarily be playing with because it's kind of easier to demonstrate some of these effects.
My first thing that I discovered on the Pod XT Live, I think I was on the forums at the time as well and looking around like Line 6 forums, I would go in and I would dial in EQ block that significantly rolled off the top end because I'm using kind of quite a lot of drive for my lead tones at least. And I always find, well, this is a lot of high-end information beyond what I'm comfortable with. Now, the more expensive modelers will have things like high cuts in the cab. Some of the cheaper modelers won't have these, but the basic principle is that you're going to start to shave off some of that high-end. This is a thing that Allan Holdsworth called shaving a haircut. I would say, for me, I tend to be quite aggressive with this because I quite like darker, warmer, muddier tones. If you're into sort of tighter tones, then this is something you'd want to experiment with, but certainly you can take it down to sort of 8K and beyond to 4K. In the Helix, in the cap block, that's a -6 dB per octave cut. In Fractal, you can adjust how much that is. Now, -6 dB per octave is the most subtle. If you go -12, it starts to move that ramp down a bit, so you get a bit more of an aggressive cut. I would say, you know, to me, being more gentle with it makes more sense. Some people, if you're using like a head rush speaker or something like that, like to shave off the low end. To me, especially if I'm using in-ear monitors, I don't find that a necessary step, because in-ear monitors kind of do so much of that already, and your sound guy is probably going to be doing that sort of thing as well. So I don't like to compound that problem. For me, the high end is the problem area. So a high cut for me is that. The high cut in itself is a bad name for what it is. It's actually like a high end roll off. It's not a cut. It's not cutting at all. It's just reducing -6 dB per octave. So it's like a gentle slope that is going to taper off your high end, essentially. Think of it more like a tone control than, you know, a cut as such. Especially as you start to use drive, and especially as you start to use in-ear monitors, that's a really important one. I wouldn't do this in the global settings of a helix or a fractal, just because those are kind of hidden and you can forget those are on. And if you're bouncing between presets, you don't know that maybe someone else has already put in high cuts elsewhere. So for me, global settings, I leave flat across devices. That's my general approach.
Now, the high cut is as pretty transparent down to even like 8 kilohertz. So what I might do instead is go the opposite direction. Now, obviously, what that effectively ends up doing is kind of making a guitar sound more distant. But what I think is that there's a sweet spot, maybe somewhere between about 4 kilohertz, which is where I set things if I know I'm going to be going into front of house. And 8 kilohertz, which is still going to be pretty direct sounding, right? Obviously do things like put it in a room. But that, to me, sounds like you've then just kind of put like a room effect on something which actually sounds still quite direct. And then this room sound happens around it. There are other things you could try in here, dynamic ambient. There's an old legacy one that my buddy Johan Lauer found. That's worth a look.
The next thing that I would suggest is maybe a good idea is this thing that Allan Holdsworth also figured out. So Allan Holdsworth started recording guitar at home, and he had this thing called a harness, which essentially would go, it was like a load box, right? Maybe one of the first load boxes. But the idea was that he was able to get direct sort of tones from his amp, turn the amp up way louder at home, and not have to, you know, deafen himself. What he found was, I guess, the same problem that we each find, in that you then have, you know, quite a direct signal. And if you go through, is it the ultimate, the UD Stomp, UD, whatever it's called, it's the delay pedal that Allan Holdsworth made with Yamaha, you'll find that there's actually some pretty interesting things that he did there. The whole point was from a single source, i.e. a microphone, trying to make that sound more like an amp in a room. So I use one specific block in a Helix for that. I'll show you that here. But this is like a multi-tap type approach, delay type approach. Somewhere between slapback and room sound. Other things you could definitely try experimenting with, but again, if you're going to be playing live, you want to use these things really quite sparingly, because it's the sort of thing that if you put this sound in another room sound, you might find that it kind of compounds these issues beyond what you're wanting to do. Equally, you know, things that might sound quite good to you in your ears, if you're using in-ear monitors on a gig, you might not want to be doing live all the time. So just be careful with some of these ideas, but certainly something to throw into the mix.
For me, one of the best things you could do is this. So dial this in or out as much as you want. This is the multi-tap delay inspired by Allan Holdsworth's actual settings. Diffusion here at 4, time at 100 milliseconds. We got our mix, that's the thing that you're going to change. Tap scale, so 24%, so 24 milliseconds to the left, panned fully left. Then tap 2, 41 milliseconds to the right, fully right. Tap 3, 75 milliseconds to the left. Tap 4, 100 to the right. So you're getting... That, to me, is actually a little bit of a really effective thing that at home might work really well, and maybe used sort of sparingly, kind of like slapback, could be effective if you're monitoring in stereo in your in-ears. I'm not so sure that this is a thing that you'd want to use too much live, but maybe at home, something you could dial in and experiment with. But those are kind of, I think, three of the biggest things you could do. Like, I've got these amp in the room. And without that block, as I say, you know, this is something you can experiment yourself, whether this high cut, whether this mic position, and whether this kind of multi-tap type approach, some of my approaches that I would suggest can get you somewhere closer to feeling like you've got a bit of that amp in the room type thing going on, that real amp type feel. These are kind of the dials that I would move for that kind of thing. If you've got multi-tap delay, those settings are pretty magical, straight from Allan Holdsworth's playbook. You know, so try that. You're tapping left to right to left to right, you're getting that like echo thing going on, but also not like a massive amount of tails from it. It's just kind of chucking that in a space, and sounds a little bit less like an effect than just using reverb or, you know, ordinary delay. So give that a try, give some of those techniques a try. Those are some things that I've found work really nicely. My number one go-to is the high cut, to be honest, and that kind of just is moving things to sounding like you're less straight in front of an amplifier, like with it blasting the top end of your eardrums off. That's quite an effective one. And then the other two kind of ideas, you know, just mic position, experimenting with that as well, can be really effective. Combine that with the use of the high cut, and maybe if you're getting really desperate, you could try this amp in the room type Allan Holdsworth thing. You want my amp in the room type tones? There's a Gumroad folder for those.
You're not having to play live and use these horrible things, in-ear monitors. So someone was asking me in the DMs the other day what I use. I think this might be part of the problem. I use KZ ZS10s, which are about the best of the cheap lot. So in-ears, basically you can pay like around £200-300 for like a Shure set, which will be pretty naff sounding. These sound a bit better than them. They got more drivers and that. Or you can spend about £1,000, and I think that seems to be where you get a bit of a better result and a bit more balanced sound. But either way, this kind of exacerbates all of the problems that modelling tends to have in digital gear, in that essentially you stick a mic in front of an amp, and it sounds a bit different because mics are not ears, you know, and you get this very direct sound. When you use these, it kind of even more accentuates how much high end there is, and the balance is all off. Basically, as the ears start to slip out and move around, if you don't have expensive molds, you lose bass response, and I think this is the main problem. So I will also get into what I've started to do instead with these ears, because when I listened back to, I was playing a gig with Charge, and I've got a full transcription of this solo that's just gone up on Patreon today, full £5 tier if you're interested in that sort of thing. I was listening back to it via desk audio, and I'm like, actually the tone there, I definitely didn't need to roll it off anymore. To me, it was like, okay, that's what I want it to sound like. But on the gig on the day, in my ears, it would have been much worse than that. The temptation will be that you've got your presets that sound how you dialed them in at home. You get to the gig, and potentially you're like, well, these are still too bright. It doesn't sound like an amp. It sounds all digital. It sounds fizzy. There's too much going on. So my temptation in that case normally would be to go and move the high cut down even more in my modeler, which I think then maybe is going to sound out front of house, like your front of house guy is going to be like, well, this is muddy or sounds distant or whatever. It may be too much. It might not. Equally, get out front of house and listen and see what you can find. Instead of making that tweak on the actual device, what I instead started saying to the sound guys is, can you go into my in-ear bus? Because everyone, if you're going to be using in-ears these days, is going to probably have the capability to do this because it's digital desks. And instead of high cutting the guitar signal even more, can you just high cut my whole bus, essentially to compensate for the overly trebly sort of harsh thing that I got going on with these IEMs, and then I'm not interfering with my guitar signal more than I already wanted to. Do you know what I mean? It's going to have enough highs in there, enough lows. The balance is going to be what I initially intended it to be. I think that's a bit of a better solution. So things to ask your sound person: can I have the sends to my ears, like pre-effects and pre-fader? And then if there's an EQ where you can sort of roll off some of that high, don't be afraid to do that across the whole bus, is what I found works quite nicely. That's a discovery this summer anyway. Again, all of these things used maybe sparingly.